Thank you, Mihaela. I'm so excited to be here and share kind of an overview of my project with you. I think that it was really tough to figure out what to present because I know that people in this workshop know a lot about derogatory terms, hate speech, slurs, and so on, and are working from a variety of different philosophical frameworks. And so I decided I needed to spend a little bit of time exposing my framework here. So for those of you who are familiar with inferentialism, forgive me. And you'll notice that I don't dig deep into it because this is a short talk, so it's very overviewy. That's kind of the basics. I'm going to do a little bit about toxicity, a little bit about how inferential role semantics works really well to explain transmission, and the concept of virality. The other thing that's been really hard about working on this toxic speech project during the pandemic is that before the pandemic, I mean, Lauren will remember when she gave comments on my first toxic speech paper way back a million years ago at WOGAP, and she was like, no, stick with genocidal language games. This toxicity, no. Remember? And there were grounds for thinking that. And a lot of people were like, what are you doing going this way? And I felt like I had to explain why I was taking this epidemiological approach. And in writing, I felt like I had to explain basic concepts of epidemiology. And now I feel like everybody is an expert on epidemiology, right? Because we've had to be in order to survive, or else we have refused to be. And then you don't want to hear about it. So I'm trying to navigate all of these different narrative issues. And you can just pick a thread and we can follow up with it in the discussion. I have to say, PowerPoint gave me this slide as a suggestion when I put the title in. So I'm really impressed with how PowerPoint has improved. I think that the people who are doing the design suggestions must also be freaked out by the pandemic. Okay, so a viral model. The other thing I'll say before moving on is that when I wrote the first toxic speech paper, which was before Donald Trump's election, I really focused on Victor Klemperer and his model of poisons. And I found that very fruitful and valuable. And at that, I presented that at Cornell, and Eric Swanson said, yeah, this is really good, but you should think about viruses too, like way back then. And I said, I will, but I have a lot of work to do still on poison. So I'm going to finish this and then I'm going to turn to viruses. So I owe Eric a debt for bringing that up. And learning more about viruses has been interesting and also terrifying. Okay. So epidemiology. This quote is from Jerry Morris from a paper called Uses of Epidemiology, which was a groundbreaking paper in 1955. And he said epidemiology studies health and disease in populations in relation to their environment and ways of living. Okay, so key concepts: population studies, environmental studies, and lifestyle studies. But lifestyle studies that sounds like something a little too hokey. It's also just your mode of living. And right after that, he says this, which is, I think, really interesting. In a society that is changing as rapidly as our own, this was 1955, epidemiology has an important duty to observe contemporary social movements for their impact on the health of the population, and to try to assess where we are making progress and where falling back. An activity in line with classic descriptions of famine and pestilence, of the relations of health and disease to social dislocations, wars, and crises. That was 1955. Now, epidemiology, you see in my little sidebars on the picture there, epidemiology is mainly about causation. But in epidemiology, you never really get causation. The most you get are risk factors. It's, just think about what you know about smoking studies and things like that. You've all been bred on Hume, so you understand causation is really hard to prove. But it's mainly in the causal realm. It's mainly holistic. It's seeking patterns. That's a real nice confluence with social practice, philosophy of language. And it's both synchronic and diachronic. It looks at what is the situation of the population's health right now, and also how has it changed over time. So they're looking at damaged health in populations. So they're looking at the distribution of damage, the determinants, and again, that doesn't really mean causal factors, it means sort of like causal factors. They're looking at both epidemics, which we're in one now, and endemic conditions. And we hear this right now. Oh, well, COVID-19 may become endemic and it'll be like the flu and we'll be able to handle it. That would be an improvement. They undertake surveillance and analysis of what they find on surveillance. And we see that now with contact tracing, looking for patterns of poor health and identifying risk factors. What's the purpose? The purpose is prevention of further and future poor outcomes. So the determinants they're looking at, the first ones in epidemiology were always physical, but as epidemiology has grown and developed, it has moved from the purely physical into environmental and social. So you look for the harm, you find the patterns, and you disrupt the patterns. This is why I like epidemiology. It's pretty straightforward. So language games. This is my picture of language games. It's embedded circles. The biggest and most holistic picture or part of the picture is are the social practices, without which all else fails. Within those social practices, we have discursive practices. With those discursive practices are made up of many language games, and those language games contain within them many speech acts. I see this as like a cell with semi-permeable membranes. It's, if you ask me what's the order of explanation, I'm going to go to social practices first, but we can talk about that later. So the thing about language games is that like epidemiology, when I look at linguistic practices, I'm looking for patterns. I'm looking synchronically and diachronically. I'm looking holistically, but it's much more in the realm of normativity than in the realm of causality. I put mainly normative instead of completely normative because we do have this concept that some words can be triggers and have a direct causal impact. So I want to leave that door open. So I thought it would be good to include some quotes from Wittgenstein here. And I actually can't see the slide, hang on. So, oops, go back. So he says a language game consists of the language and the action, it's the whole of the language and the actions into which it is woven. And he also wants us to see that it brings into prominence the fact that the speaking of a language is part of an activity or a form of life. And that ties in with what Jerry Morris argued in that first epidemiology paper, study the health and disease of populations in relation to their environment of ways of living. And the implication of that is some ways of living can make us healthier and some ways of living can make us sick. They can cause harm to us. Okay. So some basics from the Salarzian picture that I work with. And if you just keep that top row in mind, the language entry, language, and language exit moves part of the picture, you'll go a long way. So language entry, observation sentences like low rabbit, or for sellers, there is a patch of red on my visual field. The language entry allows you to take a position in a game, and it moves you from world to word. The language moves are internal to the game, and that's where inference licenses rule. Within that, one of the main kind of moves we make is deferrals. So Mihaela says, "Lo, rabbit." And then I say, "There's a rabbit in the room." And you say, "How do you know that?" And I say, "Mihaela said so." And I trust her. Okay, so I'm just going by her words and bringing them into my belief set. And then I'm using them for whatever reason. And when I'm asked about it, I go back to her, I defer. Asking about it is another kind of move within the language framework. And that's on the Brandom picture, that's called challenging. And many of you've been using Ray Langton's term blocking, which is very similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. And the similarities are all we need for our purposes right now. Language exit moves. That's something that I talked a lot about in genocidal language games, but they happen all over the place and they're not all about killing each other. Actions within a game change permissions outside of the game. So just as the actions within the game change permissions for what I can say within the game and the moves I can make within the game, they also help me when I leave the game by enabling actions. So when I go to the doctor and I tell my doctor how I'm feeling and this is what's going on and that's what's going on, I give my doctor a lot of words. And nowadays, most of us are doing that by telemedicine, right? So you get on and you do telemedicine and you tell them a lot of things and then they give you a prescription. They say, "Oh, you just need more rest." Or they say, "I'm phoning something to the pharmacy." That's moving from word to world. That was pretty fast. But anyway, so change of pace for the slides. Mary says, "My dog is in my backyard." This is a kind of quick course on inferentialism. Mary says, "My dog is in my backyard," and thereby issues inference licenses. That Mary has a dog, a backyard, the dog is in the yard, and so on. Those licenses are transferable when the hearer can use them, can defer the justification back to Mary. They're challengeable. "Mary, what dog? You have cats." And they're bound up with responsibilities. We're going to talk about that in a minute. This is where, Brandom was a student of Lewis, and Lewis's scorekeeping is all through Brandom's work. And it's in my work too. Scorekeeping is about, it's more than that, but on this picture, the part of scorekeeping that is functional is the commitments the speaker undertakes or makes, the entitlements they issue in licenses, and scorekeeping helps you keep track of the available moves. So I have this quote from Making It Explicit that inferring is a kind of doing. On Brandom's picture, it's very much a matter of inferences and assertions. And I think that's all crucial. And it's the backbone of what I do as well. But I also am really excited about and on board with the way that it isn't just about beliefs. So take Ray's paper Beyond Belief and think about accommodating attitudes. When you issue licenses, you are actually making moves that can change attitudes as well. Okay, so this is just a rough and dirty picture of the inferential role of cockroach. I use that because I know some of you are familiar with genocidal language games. The Kinyarwanda word is Inyenzi, but we hear people talk about cockroaches. If I wanted to be ambitious, I could think about the inferential role of snakes, since Donald Trump used that so much. But I don't want to. So here we go with cockroach. If you if you say that someone is a cockroach, these are some of the many things that you can infer from that. And they're pretty nasty. Like, I don't know any of them that are particularly positive. Maybe this one, emergent traits in groups. You get enough of them together and something else happens, but I don't think so. The thing is, if you think about inferential roles as having this complex structure that is somewhat web-like, and some items are more salient in a certain context and others kind of fade. Think of them as like the salient ones kind of light up and the ones that are less salient kind of darken. They don't go away, they're still there. And one of the issues I think I need to think about is how you can detach any of these from, this is, Lauren was talking about reclamation. That's been a problem. It's been how I have thought about reclamation since the 90s, is it's a problem about detaching the derogation from the inferential role. And once you start looking at these derogatory inferential roles, I don't see how you're going to do that. I'm pretty pessimistic about it. Okay, that was an aside, but I think it's worth trying, when you're thinking about a particular term, I think it's worth sketching out the inferential role as far as you can figure it out and looking to see its context of use and how those map out. So the kinds of commitments we make when we speak. On the Brandon view, there's three: identificatory, assertional, and expressive. He kind of pushes the referencey side of it to the background. He doesn't deny that, well, that's not the key thing. The key thing for Brandon is the assertional. What is said, identify what is said. Can it be defended? Do you defend it? Can you justify it? And there, Frege's judgments come into play. He also talks about expressive commitments. This is where I really hop on board when you're thinking about the power of language to shape social reality, because expressive commitments are commitments to the viability and value of a particular way of talking. So with what we need to do with these is we track the moves, what has been made, what is available. We look at the commitments and licenses, and we look at the salience factors and the way that power is being enacted, particularly through the expressive commitments. So when someone uses an expressive commitment, those people are such so-and-sos. I'm not going to use an actual slur, but those people are such so-and-sos. And, or that group, I'll say this, that group, they're terrorists. That's not it's not a targeted to a specific identity, though it often is. Okay, when you say that, how is power being enacted when you do it? And how do you defend the use of it? Okay, that was a really fast whirlwind introduction to the structure. A couple of things about accommodating, because I know that many people in the workshop are using this, and I like it too. So accommodating is adjusting the rules of and score to make prior actions count as correct play. So connecting that to game moves. It's a matter of adjusting the internal licenses of an inferential role, and this alters the habits of discursive action. That alters what we say next. It's a matter of adjusting exit licenses. It alters what we do next, non-discursively. It's not just informational, cognitive, or doxastic, it's all of that, and so it's action engendering. Accommodating different practices and different actions. For instance, many of the killers in Rwanda called slaughter work, and then they worked at it. So with many of the kinds of things that have been under discussion in the workshop, I think accommodating attitudes are crucial. They're key to understanding contagions, I think. And I just want to give a shout out to Robin Jeshine's work on crystallization and amalgamation. I think it's really in her sort of more recent work on expression, which we'll hear about, I think, very soon. So, okay, so toxicity. When you look up toxicity in biochemistry and medical journals and stuff, they'll say it's the degree to which a substance, a toxin or poison, can harm humans or animals. That works so well with poisons. right? Because like lead is a substance. It doesn't work as well with viruses because viruses are, I think a better word would be agents, right? The degree to which an agent can harm humans or animals. So that's something to think about. So the toxicity can be acute from a single or short-term exposure. Polonium works that way. It can be chronic, where the damage accrues over an extended period, usually repeated or continuous exposure, sometimes lifelong damage. Lead poisoning, arsenic poisoning are like that. The third category, which I'm not going to go into any further, is subchronic, and that's it takes more than one dose usually, and the effects last more than a year, but less than your lifetime. So it's pretty long term, but it's not forever. With toxicity, we need to ask, is it normative or causal? Is it holistic? And how do we seek the patterns? So discursive toxicity. I just throw discursive in there, the degree to which a speech, act, or practice can harm humans or animals. Simple. Not so easy to measure. Okay, acute toxicity, damage from a single or short-term exposure. Well, certain threats, some hurled epithets might work that way. And usually there's a kind of rapid onset. So a speech act that counts as like a punch in the gut. And that isn't always going to have a trigger term in it. Sometimes it can be a whole sentence. Sometimes it can be something really idiopathic and not something tied to larger practices of damage. We can talk about that later if you want. Chronic toxicity is really where a lot of the social harms arise. So the damage accrues over an extended period. It's usually repeated and continued exposure. It's sometimes lifelong damage. It has a cumulative effect. So what is that? It's like gaslighting, undermining some threats, derogations, and discriminatory speech work there. Is this mainly causal? I don't know. It's definitely holistic. And again, we're seeking patterns, and we're going to look at it both synchronically, what happened in the moment, and also diachronically. How did this get set up? How is it possible that this speech can mean what it means, that this speech can create the accommodations that it accommodates, and so on. So these four factors of toxicity: material, dose, roots, and susceptibility. In Adam Kucharski's book, The Rules of Contagion, he talks about the 4 dots. A very similar kind of framework. Different epidemiologists will map it out very slightly differently. But the bottom line is you've got what's delivering the harm. You've got the dose, how much you've got right now and how concentrated it is. So if it's a derogatory term, is it a really highly charged derogatory term or a relatively milder derogatory term? That would be the concentration. The dose would be, did you get 1? Did you get 2? Did you get 20? Did you get 1 every hour? Someone I know who directs a boys' camp told me that in the average middle schooler hears 1,500 anti-gay slurs in a week. I don't know if that's true. I don't know he's a psychologist, so I don't know where he got the data, but just think about that. If that's true, that would be a case of repeated dosing, and they could be highly concentrated, they could be lower concentration, it could be variable. Susceptibility is liability to be harmed, and that's going to depend upon uptake and your absorption, how pervious or impervious you are to whatever it is that's being delivered, and what kind of immunities you have. The roots, think about all the trouble we went to with the COVID crisis. How was it being delivered, right? And so I don't know about you. Were you washing your groceries when they came in the house? Were you letting your mail sit in the garage or in the mailbox for days and days and then wiping it down with Clorox wipes if you could get them? Probably most people were, and if they could. And that's because at first we thought it could have been delivered by contact. Then they discovered, no, it's delivered airborne. And I think this distinction, which is in epidemiology between contact delivery and airborne delivery, is really important, because the airborne delivery is just so much harder, and we all know this now, it's so much harder to avoid. So what are our airborne deliveries of toxic speech? I think widespread cultural presuppositions that are anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ+, anti-BIPOC, and so on. I think these are serious airborne parts of our discursive and cultural frameworks. I've gone through this really fast. So another way, I said something about this right at the beginning, about toxic delivery. The common source model is something you'll see in epidemiology books, where they'll talk about the poisoned well. And I won't go into that. I say more about that in a talk I'm going to give at the joint session this summer, and it'll be in the proceedings of the joint session. The poisoned well model fits really well with a single source. It describes a single source like an actual poisoned well that people drink from. You take the pump handle off the well and people stop getting sick. Donald Trump's tweets, they were like the poisoned well in the sense that they gave you a direct dose of a toxin. So this is not the first tweet. His first tweet was on March 16th, 2020. I couldn't find a photo of it. This was one of his early tweets using the phrase Chinese virus. I'm not going to read it out loud, and I feel bad about saying it, but that phrase has done tremendous damage to Asian Americans and Asians all around the world. So single source, Donald Trump was definitely a source of anti-Asian harm. Okay, so the thing is, the single source can propagate, but the viral transmission, I think, is so much more interesting, because you can have multiple sources, you can have susceptibility variation, that is, some people are susceptible to it and others it rolls right off them, and variation is possible within transmission. So here I think about the telephone game. I actually looked up to try to find like a meme of the telephone game, and I found out that there's a name for it, which is Chinese whispers. I don't know if you've ever heard that. I never heard it, but the telephone game was always a lot of fun to play when we were kids, because the you start off with something relatively innocuous, and if you have enough people, by the time you get to the end, it's something absolutely ridiculous, because people have changed it. They've misheard and repeated and changed it along the way. We're already seeing viral mutation happening. It doesn't operate exactly the same way, but that kind of mutation of the message is something that all of our discourse allows us to do. And one of the things to just go back, so someone occupying the Oval Office of the United States who tweets out racist propaganda, in doing that is licensing other people to use that racist propaganda. And in their doing it, they're not always going to just repeat him verbatim. They're going to like twist it and play with it and do their own thing with it. And so new variations of the racist propaganda proliferate. And so that's why we get to this picture. Okay, so I actually kind of wanted to start this talk saying how disturbed and upset I was about the murders in Atlanta of 6 Asian American women. But I decided that we needed more framework for me to explain why, like, how does that happen? And, you know, the police officer who shall not be named saying, well, he had a really bad day. I'm sorry. That's not an explanation. That's just, to use Kate Mann's term, that's sympathy writ large. Here, you see the embeddedness of these hate crimes, these racist, misogynist hate crimes, if you just look at this one case. So we start from the history, I'm going backwards from the top down. There were actual laws in the 19th century to keep Chinese out of the US. And most people start with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which wasn't really overturned until 1943. And even then, it wasn't until 1965 that Chinese could own land in the US. It's a little known fact, but it's true. But the Page Act of 1875, which came before the Chinese Exclusion Act, banned, and the term they used was Oriental women, but they mainly applied it to Chinese women coming to the US, and the language is for immoral purposes. And that was the assumption that the only reason that a woman from Asia would come was for immoral purposes. So we're back to, calling them sluts, keep going back to Lauren's talk. And so we exclude them. So that was law from 1875 until 1943. But in 1943, they introduced a new law that allowed Chinese immigration of 105 Chinese people per year. So it's like, oh, okay, let's open the door a crack. But it wasn't until the 60s, 1965, that Chinese were allowed to actually own property. And the language was ethnic Chinese. It wasn't Chinese nationals. So step one, there were actual laws in our history, and those laws create entrenched attitudes and beliefs. But then there's all the rhetoric and propaganda that's very recent from Donald Trump and the white nationalists. But so when we think about that, it's really easy to jump straight ahead to Trump's tweets. But we have to, I think, also take a step back and look at his trade war with China starting in 2018, and the fear that inculcated. He was dosing us with fear of China. So 2018, doses of fear. 2020, scapegoating and making people come to have attitudes about the dangerousness of contact with Chinese people by way of his tweets, and the exit moves. Stop AAPI Hate reports 3,795 incidents of attacks on Asian Americans in less than 1 year, from March of 2020 to February of 2021. And that's what's reported. There's really strong reason to believe, for cultural reasons, that a lot does not get reported. Okay, that includes the whole range from verbal harassment, shunning, physical assault to murder. So when you think, how do we track this? We can't just look at the specific hate crime. We can't just look at the speech that surrounded the hate crime. We have to look at the mode of life and the history of discourse around that mode of life. So when I say that toxic speech can make us sick, the easiest way to see that is to look at stress. Psychologists will look at that and say, well, yeah, there's a biopsychosocial continuum there. With this picture, I want you to look from the bottom up and start with positive stress. There's a reaction. Positive stress is good. It's like having pre-game jitters. It's how you feel before you start the marathon. It's or your tennis match. It helps to activate the body's chemistry and boost focus and energy. And it's a reaction to a challenging situation, which may help you grow. Good thing. We need stress. So stress is not in itself a villain. Tolerable stress is more severe than positive stress. It tends to be tied to more enduring challenges. Examples that they give in the literature are parental death or divorce. And it's tolerable because even though it can be world-shattering, there's social and emotional support that enables us to get through it. We learn how to live with it and deal with it. Toxic stress, on the other hand, overwhelms the immune system. So instead of just boosting our adrenaline and cortisol, our adrenaline and cortisol are like in overdrive and stuck. And it arises from trauma. Anyone among us who's living with PTSD knows it doesn't just go away because you wish it would. It comes from trauma or prolonged adversity. We are living with prolonged adversity right now with this pandemic. But our prolonged adversity is different than the kind of trauma that the Tutsi who fled for their lives and hid in the marshes suffered in the genocide. We have a wide range of possibilities. So when you think about how our speech practices can inflict actual physical harm, bridging the normative to the causal, I think stress is the place where we have that bridge. And we get that bridge because we are these complex beings that are both normative and physical. Okay, we're not going to read this whole slide, but I want you to just know about ACE scores, adverse childhood experiences. And I'm happy to send this to anybody who's interested. The very first ACE score is, did a parent or other adult in your household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you? 62% of people surveyed, and this is a huge sample, have at least one ACE score. And the most common ACE score is that number 1. But people with 4 or more ACEs are 37.5 times as likely to try to commit suicide. That's not an accident. They're 3.2% as likely to have COPD, 2 to 2.5% more likely to have cancer, diabetes, and stroke, and so on. And so here's the picture. When you have these ACEs, it goes from, on the bottom, the adverse childhood experiences, which are resting on social conditions and local context, and often generational embodiment and historical trauma that's built into your mitochondrial DNA. The speech acts that deliver much of that disrupt neurodevelopment. They damage social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, and they ultimately lead to high-risk behavior, disease, disability, social problems, and much earlier death. Mihaela, am I out of time?
So we have 20 minutes for discussion. So.
Okay, let me say one quick thing to close up, which is not that. I just want to say morbidity and mortality is something that doctors do when they it's like the hospital rounds do this. And I'm thinking that those of us who care about the power of language to shape social reality, they assess cases to find better practices. What if we did this for discursive harms and the practices from which they arise? I think that would be really awesome. I think I'm going to stop.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for.
So I'm going to stop the share.
Yes, now we can see each other.
Now I can see everyone.
Please put your question in the chat. If you're a junior, preface them with a J. I see Bianca already, so go on.
Hi. Thanks a lot, Lynne. This has been very exciting. So I have a question about immunitary reactions. So, well, with viruses and all of that, we have we have a system that is able to defend ourselves, and over time, if the attack is not too strong, this helps us. And actually, we have technology so that those who are in a position to defend themselves through this system can help others. So I was wondering whether you could see any place for this immunity or in the virus metaphor or not.
Yes. So one of the people who I've studied, his work is now somewhat out of date. I always like to go back to the beginning, is Bill McGuire, who was a social psychologist at Yale, and William J. McGuire. And he's considered the father of inoculation theory in social psych. I'm just going to call him the parent or initiator, right? But he did a lot of research. He and his team did a lot of research on trying to inoculate, particularly youth, against destructive health behaviors like smoking, teen pregnancy, things like that. But let's just take smoking, for example, or binge drinking. And what they found was that they have a whole complex arrangement of or understanding of the order or the factors that make a difference to whether you take up the messages that could in fact help make you immune to urges that other people try to urge you to do something and you shouldn't do it. What can give you immunity, say, to peer pressure for smoking? Well, it depends who's giving you the anti-smoking message. It depends on a lot of different related factors. So McGuire and his team did this really interesting social psych work, and they laid out all these factors, and they were able to track some of the people who they felt really did gain some immunity to negative peer pressures. But what they found is it only works for a while, kind of like our vaccines, right? So you can get the vaccine and maybe it'll keep you, I mean, just think about it in terms of teen pregnancy, right? Well, if you're heterosexual and you get this message about teen pregnancy, and you take the message and you kind of run with it because it came from a good source or a lot of different good sources, and the message was clear and all these other factors, is that going to keep you from ever having sex? No, right? And there's going to be a way in which your own growth and development is going to make that message become less relevant because it's about teen pregnancy and you're not a teen anymore. Because it was about certain kinds of sexual encounters and that's not what you do, and so on. And so, yes, the inoculation model is one to pursue. And I think there's social science literature that we can draw on. And what it tells me is that it's not a one and done, one shot and done like the J&J vaccine. It's something where it's good. You need boosters, you need cultural change, but it could get you through a hard time until the cultural change comes.
And you, thanks a lot. And you think this can work for slurs too?
This can work for slurs? Yeah, I think, so I talk about this in my toxic speech inoculations and antidotes paper. But what I think is that, you know, you take a kid who is subjected to slurs at school, their peer culture is very important to them. So they're not going to just automatically get the dose when they come home and they tell their parents what other kids said to them, and their parents say, but you know, that's not true. That's not going to be enough, right? So what is it going to take? It's either going to take the development of an alternative peer group so that that peer group becomes less capable of dosing them, or it's going to take something more powerful from the parents. And the example that I give in the paper is about mother and the aunt talking to a little girl, an African-American girl who was being mocked for her hair. And, you know, they're touching her hair, they're talking about the beauty of their hair, her hair, but it's physical, it's emotional, and it's discursive. And so they were hitting it on all fronts. And it helped. Was it sufficient forever? I don't think so.
Thanks.
Because culture is powerful.
Yeah. So we have Lauren and then Anna. We have plenty of time, so you should go ahead.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm not as negative about the idea of using toxicity as you might have suggested at the beginning. I still think I'm a little puzzled about a couple of things, or rather, yeah, I just need a little bit of help to think through how a couple of the parts work, and I think I can kind of see an answer for one concern I have, but I think there might be sort of another feature. At least one other feature that sort of gets papered over by using this sort of metaphor rather than other ones that you've used. So I was thinking about the idea that the material that you're infected with is homophobia or racism or misogyny or something like that. And that kind of seems like right as a view of what happens amongst communities of people who then might go on to use the words later. You know, they start, you know, unthinkingly spreading things around that shapes the way that they're thinking, and being infected in this way can help you spread it. I'm not sure how, if that's a kind of infection and harm that's happening, if that sort of is neglecting the sort of differential harm to the people who are targets of the word, and I don't know whether it's sort of worth whether you're thinking about this sort of on the model of asymptomatic carriers in a way. Like, there's some people who just aren't harmed by the infection and they spread it very easily, and then there are the people who are really harmed by the infection. I'm not sure whether one is harmed by the homophobia, but I'm not sure that one catches the homophobia. So that's one. I think there's probably ways to think about that, but still a little unsure about the actual application of the metaphor. The thing that I'm not sure, that I think is sort of papered over a little bit here, is it neglects the kind of benefits to the people who are asymptomatic carriers. In a way. So insofar as racist, misogynistic, homophobic speech can help with community building amongst certain groups of people, you know, they're just in our common way of thinking about viruses and toxins, there's sort of no real benefit. I mean, there's benefit to being asymptomatic, right, as opposed to symptomatic, but it's not like by being asymptomatic, you're better than not being infected. So I wondered how you think about that sort of benefit on this model.
Thanks. And I didn't mean to set you up as the long-term naysayer. It was just your initial reaction was like, no, I like genocidal language games, which was very nice. That was very nice. Your question actually is great, and I kind of don't want to completely answer it because I'm giving a talk on that at the Central APA. which is called Uses and Abuses of Damaging Speech. And so what I'm thinking there is like, okay, like I don't really get to say that like I like how you put the asymptomatic carrier isn't necessarily better off than the person who's never had any contact, say with COVID, right? And there's always the threat that the asymptomatic carrier will become symptomatic. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion right now among scientists about that very question. And I think with language, that's the threat, right? That's the threat. But the community building among people strikes me as, you know, it strikes me that with the people who do not see themselves as harmed by their contact with the virus, think that having the power over others that the Speech Act gives them is worth it. It's worth it. And so there is a community building factor that is not part of, it isn't part of what the virus doses, but it is part of what it creates. So what can, you know, so for me, I don't know if this is failing to answer your question because I'm trying to avoid the other part that I'm going to talk about at APA. But for me, the framework is, how do we talk about how this gets transmitted from person to person? Like, how does it get uptake? And so there's a way in which part of what I'm papering over is uptake. And I do talk about that in papers, but I didn't talk about it in today's talk. And so it's very possible. I mean, most of us we can argue about whether we're symptomatic or asymptomatic, but like I was thinking about David Beaver's comments earlier today about watching the Bond movies and like all the horrible things that we've all been exposed to across our lifetimes, so that when someone tells a really racist joke or a really sexist joke or some kind of anti-BIPOC thing, we know what they're saying. We get it in a way that you, Lauren, might not get it as well, having grown up in New Zealand, where it isn't as deeply part of your immunity structure, you know, and your now I'm mixing the metaphor, but you have to come at it from the outside, whereas for a lot of us, we can just pull it up, and that makes us complicit in it in a way that is, I think most of the time, none of us are fully asymptomatic. I think most of the time we are more or less symptomatic. And one of the things that these jokes and other things do is show us that we still have it and we don't want it. Some people do, they embrace it. They're white supremacists who think it's great. They are misogynists who are proud of being entitled men and so on. So on the one hand, I want to say, I don't think there is anyone who's completely unharmed once there's contact, but there are degrees of fit between the virus and the way of being that the person is inhabiting. And we didn't go into that. If I had gone into the morbidity and mortality, then what's going to cause illness in me is going to actually make the white supremacist grow and thrive.
Yeah, just
did I answer part of the question? Yes. I was trying not to answer all of it because of the. I don't want to.
Not everything about a metaphor can be necessarily has to come over. Carry over. It can still be useful for modeling part of things. One thing I just do quickly want to clarify is that I would not want to say that I was in any way inoculated from racism by growing up in a part of New Zealand where there were not just very few racial, so there's a whole lot of racism, right? But it's just not spread in the same kind of way. And there's this way in which coming to America, like I don't know what some words mean until people explain things to me. And I come to understand the whole context. You know, there's a difference there with viruses, right? So I come to the US and it's the first time that I really have the flu because I have no immunity. Whereas I come to the US and I don't understand all of these different racial slurs, and so I'm immune in that way, but I don't have the same sort of immunity to viruses. Thank you. Yes, you did.
That's helpful.
Great. So we have 2 more minutes, but we can continue in the break. Anna, you have a question. Go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you. I find this so incredibly interesting and illuminating. Thanks a lot for that. I think my question, maybe it ties in with some of the other questions quite well. One of the things that I was thinking about when talking about like epidemics and this kind of stuff, specifically in the context of the US. And I should say I don't know enough because I've never lived in the US, nor am I from the US, so I really don't know enough. But this whole talk about the crack epidemic in the US seems to me like to be a very different use of this kind of sense of epidemic, because what it looks like to me is if when they kind of came up with this idea of there is an epidemic going on and now we need to intervene, we need to do something, they really behaved in that way. We need to stop spreading something. I mean, we know that like what they actually did was something very different. So it seems to me that this is kind of maybe a misuse, that maybe this could be read as a misuse of that framework, you know, how it's applied in a really harmful way, to like further, you know, discriminate against people and harm them and lock them up. Then we would do it, you know, we would talk about it when it comes to spreading hate speech. So I was wondering if you know, if what you think about that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That's great. My answer can be short, Mihaela. So so I don't run too much overtime. I tend to talk longer, give longer answers. I just want to say both the crack epidemic language and the opioid epidemic language are not real epidemics. They are just overuse, and there is a drug problem. I mean, the opioid and crack, you know, one is big pharma and the other is underground pharma, right? And so they have different sources of access, but they're not contagious. And they don't fit the poison well model either, because it isn't like someone is putting opioids or crack in the water supply or in the food supply. There is actually, in certain regions of the country, quite a bit of both cocaine and methamphetamines on money, which is really creepy. But I mean, like on paper money, but paper money is probably going away since the pandemic, who knows? So I think you're right. These are actually not epidemics. They're just widespread medical and social problems. And what they're similar to epidemics is that they're both medical and social. And so that is, you know, that's something for me to think about. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
So we have finished in time. Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you again, Lynne, for a wonderful talk and great discussion.
Thank you.